Let's review a debate between Richard Wolff, university professor, and Destiny, popular streamer, on the subject of capitalism and socialism. Richard Wolff will be arguing in favor of socialism, while Destiny will be defending the merits of a capitalist system with government interventions. A sock-dem approach. The first direct criticism to the opposing economic system will be levied by Destiny.
As of March 2021, Americans rank the economy, job markets, the handling of the coronavirus, and leadership in Washington as the four most important challenges facing our country. Socialist policies would not alleviate any of these concerns. Countries have tried the socialist experiment. Time and time again, this has failed. Doctors in Cuba moonlight as taxi drivers. Countries with socialized healthcare haven't fared much better than the U.S. in their handling of the coronavirus. And any socialist regime will necessarily involve the bureaucracy of Washington even more heavily in our economy. Any country that has attempted to realize a fully socialist economy has either failed completely, such as in the case of the USSR, destroyed large swaths of their economy, such as in Venezuela, or been forced to embrace more neoliberal economic policies to realize true growth in their economy, such as in China or Vietnam. Liberal market policies work better in both theory and practice when it comes to efficiently allocating resources to maximizing the economic productivity of any country, and we've seen this play out time and time again across a wide variety of markets and countries throughout history across the globe.
Richard Wolff will take issue with his first premise.
I have no idea what this silly remark that I hear so often is, that no socialist society has succeeded at anything. I have no idea what you're talking about. Let me give you an example. In 1917, when the Soviet Union begins, it is the poorest country in Europe by far. It then goes through 70 years of a lost World War I, of a civil war, of an agricultural collectivization, and of World War II, which did more damage in Russia than in any other country. Notwithstanding that it was the poorest country at the beginning of this horrific story, it ends up in 1965 being the #1 competitor of the United States for global hegemony. That's only because of its #1 status in economic growth that it achieved the overcoming of all those horrific losses. And the same thing is true now. If you read Pearl Buck's novels about China before the revolution, you will hear about a society whose depth of poverty literally blows your mind. And here they are about to surpass the United States before the end of this decade. And that was accomplished by a communist revolution and a government that has been run by a communist party to this day.
Destiny will respond to these points.
I'm not saying that the USSR did not grow a lot. Obviously, the USSR grew massively. Your claim is not that the USSR grew. That's not what we're arguing about. It's whether or not the USSR grew at the rate that it did due to socialism. A country that was heavily involved in multiple famines, a country that heavily went from little industrialization to a lot of industrialization, and a country that engaged in a lot of imperialistic practices is a country that grew massively in the 20th century. To say that all of their growth, or even the majority of their growth, was due to the organization of their economy and not due to factors that were independent of that organization, to say otherwise that they wouldn't have grown maybe at an even faster rate had they been a capitalist economy, there would have to be some evidence provided for that. And I don't believe that that's ever been adequately demonstrated. On the contrary, I believe some people have argued that Russia could have potentially grown, the USSR could have potentially grown even faster had it abandoned some of its more outdated forms of trying to manage their economy. When we bring up China, China has grown a lot under certain socialist policies for sure. But when we look at China, especially in the 80s and 90s, China began opening itself up to massive growth when it comes to foreign investment. China is the #2 country in the world that allows for foreign direct investment. And the coalescing of all of China's state-owned, the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, into a select few industries, and then the massive opening of foreign investment into that country to give other people more control over privately owned businesses has been what has caused the massive explosion that we've seen of China in terms of pulling people out of global poverty, as you mentioned in the video that you did for the Gravel Institute.
On these matters, the academic professor will get the last word.
I want to correct something about China because you keep repeating it.
Okay.
You know why private enterprise and private capital flows into China in the 80s and 90s? Because China had transformed itself from a place where nobody wanted to invest to a place like now where everybody does. Capitalist enterprises went there because they had a well-educated, disciplined labor force at very low wages because they had built an extraordinary infrastructure, because you had a growing level of income for people to buy things. That's why General Motors produces and sells more cars in China than it does in the United States. The reason private capital went there was because they had, before the arrival, created the institutions. Every other part of the so-called third world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, who had received since the Second World War massive amounts of foreign aid, were desperately trying to do what the Chinese were doing, namely, develop their countries so that foreign private investment would come. China didn't get any foreign aid because they were communists and the United States didn't give them any. But they did a better job than all the countries who did get it in order to get to the point of economic development where it became interesting for capitalists in Japan and Europe to go there. You need to pretend, for reasons I do not understand, that all of the achievements I've just described didn't happen, that somehow they don't deserve the credit. Look, in the world of economics, maybe perhaps you're not familiar, we do exactly what you just said we oughtn't to do. We look at societies and say, they have a capitalist economic system. How did they do? And they have a socialist system with the different meanings of that term. And how did they do? And then we say they're different, and part, not all, part of the story is the different system.
After this back and forth, the debate will reach a bit of a roadblock on the definition of terms.
Can I ask you, when you say socialist, what do you mean when you say socialist then? I'm trying to understand what this means.
Wolff will give an explanation.
That's good. No, let me answer. There are a variety. I'll give you three basic strains right now. They don't exhaust it, but they enable us to have a conversation. One strain: you leave enterprises in the hands of private capitalists, but you recognize that that capitalist system is so flawed, for example, in terms of inequality, in terms of business cycle instability, that you give a role to the government of massive intervention, rules, regulations, laws. You know, let me give you some examples. In France, it's the law that once you begin working after graduating from high school or college, every employer has to give you 5 weeks of paid vacation from the beginning. Nothing like that exists in the United States. But this is a society that won that for its people, by the way, by socialists who did that, and put that on the books, as it is on most European countries. And socialists do that because they believe, for them, that socialism is when the government comes in and regulates. That's one kind. Here's a second kind. These second kind of socialists, they don't believe it works real well if you do that. It's not enough. So they want to take a different step. They want the government to come in and actually own and operate enterprises, not merely regulate them with rules and laws. Then there's a third kind, which I stressed a few moments ago, which is not about the government. Doesn't care all that much whether the government runs an enterprise or the private does. They can figure out, whichever one works better. Let's be real practical. But for them, what socialism means is the transformation of the everyday life of working people. No longer do you go to work with other people telling you what to do, where to sit, what machine to use, what raw material to work on. And at the end of the day, you go home and you've got nothing more to say about what you poured your brains and muscles into. No, no, no. For these socialists, like me, the crucial thing is to reorganize the workplace, to bring real democracy, can you believe it, to the place where we work.
Essentially, Wolff clarifies that because of its historical development, one can define multiple versions of socialism. He broadly gives three. The first appears to be similar to the social democrat position Destiny supports: more government intervention in a capitalist framework. The second, a government-controlled economy, is instead the definition that Destiny had been using for socialism. And the third, the movement to bring democracy to the workplace, is the version Richard Wolff actually embraces and would like to implement. Unfortunately, because of a mismatch on definitions, much of the debate will be stuck trying to clarify terms.
Okay, can you tell me what is your definition of capitalism then?
When a tenuous understanding is reached, the issue is turned to why would anybody invest in a worker-owned enterprise?
Private investment is a completely different matter. You can have private investment and worker co-ops.
How?
It exists. What's the problem?
Why would I ever invest in a company without gaining some amount of equity in the company? They have no obligation to return to me any profit. I would never invest in a co-op.
Richard Wolff will give his answer.
Why would you invest in you invest in businesses in the United States?
Correct, because businesses.
For example, let me finish. Hoping, for example, for something called a capital gain.
Mm-hmm.
You hope that if you buy the shares and if the company does real well, you will be able to sell the shares at some future point to another investor at a higher price.
Correct.
If that company's growth is the product of its worker co-op organization, you're perfectly happy if you can make an investment that grows over time.
But Destiny is not convinced that there can be private investment without some form of assurance for the investors.
Why would any individual ever invest in a company that doesn't have a fiduciary responsibility to their investors? So for instance, in your world, if I were to buy 20% of a co-op, their workers tomorrow could say, you know what? We're all bored. We don't want to do this anymore. We're going to move on. We're shutting the business down. And now I've just completely lost out on my investment because they have no responsibility to me because I have non-controlling shares. If the only shares you're selling are non-controlling, why would any private investment ever come in knowing that that co-op never has an obligation to make a profit or return a dividend to the investors?
The debaters don't manage to reach an agreement on this point.
The people who give them the money are gambling. They hope that they can sell the shares for more, and they will sell the shares to anybody who can buy them. The company's not responsible to buy those shares. The company's not responsible for what price they can get. If they lose their shirt, tough luck. It's not an obligation or a responsible. That's the way the law of this country works for the stock market. And there's no problem in a worker co-op saying to investors, we're going to grow better than what you can get from a capitalist enterprise. So buying a share of our stock will give you a better shot to sell it at a higher price later.
Now to the scoring. Rhetorically, Professor Wolff came out of the gate swinging, and Destiny quickly matched his energy, albeit with two different styles of debating. This stylistic mismatch, coupled with an aggressive tone, didn't aid the discussion. Which brings us to the substantive elements discussed. The debate was brief, and most of the discussion was dedicated to clearing up definitions. Wolff tried to clarify his stance, but maybe due to the long-winded explanation, Destiny did not seem to immediately catch what the professor's position was. Quite a shame, since there seemed to be much more to debate on the possible implementation of democracy in the workplace. It would have been nice if Destiny had been more receptive regarding Wolff's definition of socialism, so that there could have been more time to discuss possible differences in policies between the debaters. On the other hand, I think Wolff confused him by ardently defending the USSR and China's version of socialism beforehand. These types of socialism are not renowned to have an emphasis on workplace democracy. Regarding the topic of the debate, this was the first time I was exposed to the third version of socialism Richard Wolff defined. I found workplace democracy an interesting idea. My first thought regarded the efficiency of the decision-making process of an enterprise that had workplace democracy. But I quickly dismissed this as a non-fatal problem. After all, a dictatorship is the most efficient form of government, but we shy away from it because it's highly unstable and risks creating huge amounts of suffering. So we are already willing to sacrifice efficiency for less suffering regarding our form of government. Workplace democracy could also be worth the trade-off. Plus, it turns out that some research actually finds worker co-ops as being more efficient and productive than investor-owned businesses. I did, however, have some concerns regarding other kinds of practical implementations, like private investing. For me, Professor Wolff was a bit too dismissive of Destiny's doubts on the matter, especially considering that the Democracy at Work Institute states that worker cooperatives also have a complicated relationship with investment capital, because a fundamental feature of reform is that worker owners own and control the business, and investors are often reluctant to risk capital without some form of control. Apparently, one of the practical ways worker co-ops can raise capital is by issuing preferred stock with a dividend. But this is not the video to delve deeply into this topic. Maybe in the future. To conclude, I was a bit surprised on how cutthroat the debate was between what some might say are two different versions of socialists. But hey, the left liked its infighting.